Welcome back to Boilers and Beyond. I'm Jordan Jones. We are back here today as we are inside 50 days until kickoff. Yes, less than 50 days remain until Purdue takes the field under Ryan Walters for the first time. A noon kickoff against Fresno State on September 2nd. But, with about 7 weeks to go here, we've got a hodgepodge of topics today, all of them related to Purdue, that we're going to talk about. We're still a week or two away from getting into kind of the countdown to kickoff series that we do each year. So I appreciate those of you who reached out with some topics, both on Twitter, by tweeting me at BoilersBeyond. Please follow over there if you don't already. And by email. You can always email the show, boilersandbeyondpod@gmail.com. So thank you to those of you who reach out both ways and interact with the show. It is always a blast to hear from you guys. But, I want to start it this week by looking at what, has become the story of the summer in college athletics, and that is the situation happening just up I-65 at Northwestern. As bizarre of a situation as I can remember. This was something that on a Friday afternoon, Friday evening maybe even, it gets announced that Pat Fitzgerald is going to be suspended for 2 weeks during the summer, which, is much of a non-punishment as you can possibly think of, given that, this is the slowest time of the year for college football coaches leading into media day. And then by Monday evening, just 72 hours later, he's fired. And, really marking the end of a very successful era of Northwestern football. And, a situation where quite possibly the most beloved figure in that program's history is now fired. Something that, really you don't see often. This is not apples to apples, but this is, Bobby Knight being fired at Indiana. This is, this is pretty crazy. Kind of a loss for words, I don't really want to get into much to what did or didn't go on or what Pat Fitzgerald did or didn't know. Obviously, if you listen to this show, you probably have seen the details of the hazing allegations that were going on in the program, some of them sexual in nature, a lot of them very disturbing. This is going to get litigated out pretty heavily. Pat Fitzgerald has already said, he's retaining legal counsel. He's going to seek to get some of that money that is owed on his contract. I think I've seen something like $42 million are left on his deal. He really was going to be the head coach for life at Northwestern if he wanted to be. These are going to be some hefty lawsuits. It's going to be fascinating. The one thing about this that is really, really curious is that at the end of an investigation, Northwestern makes the decision to suspend him for 2 weeks, and then it turns into a firing after a weekend, just 3 days later. Obviously, details became more public over that time. We probably will never know the full truth of it, but very, very curious. It's going to be interesting to see how this winds up. It's interesting with Northwestern kind of saying that they don't know how much Pat Fitzgerald knew, but it's his responsibility to know. I think Pat Fitzgerald is going to get paid out through this. I assume they'll settle, but I think Pat Fitzgerald is going to get some money here. But, just from a more fallout perspective of this, Northwestern obviously over the last couple years has not been what it was. You look at the last 4 seasons. In 2020, they broke through. They won the Big Ten West, and they gave Justin Fields and Ohio State a pretty good game in the Big Ten title game. Outside of that, though, 3-9, 3-9, and 1-11 in 2019, 2021, and 2022. And, you just think about what this program is now. It's in a pretty difficult spot. This historically, has been a very, very weak program in the Big Ten. Historically pretty non-competitive. You look at what's happened under Pat Fitzgerald, and, they've seen some success, probably the most success they've ever had in that program's history, at least in the, even remotely modern era. But, now the way college football is going, the NIL, the transfer portal, it makes this job really difficult. And I know I've talked about this before, but it's just worth pointing out here. This isn't a school in Northwestern that can really do much in the transfer portal. I know like all of their transfers that they brought in this year, I think there were 6 of them, they're all grad transfers, because for them to get undergraduate transfers in, it's really hard with how credits don't transfer there, and the standards of admission. Northwestern's not really going to compromise on that. That's a really big problem for Northwestern. You look at the NIL world, and it's kind of that classic, the school has money, the alumni have money, but do they care about winning in sports? And I think generally with the elite academic institution types, that answer tends to be no. And historically with Northwestern, I think that's pretty fair. It's kind of been one guy, at least from an outsider's perspective, it's been one guy donating all the money to run that place. So, it's going to be interesting. A 16-team Big Ten, that really hurts Northwestern even more. Losing the Big Ten West hurts them. It's a program that exclusively relies on player development. And in the transfer portal day and age, it's hard because they can lose transfers. It's no problem for a guy to leave Northwestern after his sophomore year. But, if they've got a big hole, if they've got a hole at receiver, they're pretty limited in who they can go get there to patch a hole. So, what they do long term is going to be interesting. This is a program that's never finished inside the top 40 in recruiting, has rarely finished inside the top 50. I thought they were going to be pretty bad this year before all of this stuff even came out. You look at their roster, it didn't inspire a ton of confidence. After they went 1-11 last year, they lose to, I think it was Southern Illinois. They lose their last 11. Non-competitive in a good amount of those games too. They've got this guy David Braun. He's going to be their interim head coach. He was going to be in his first year as the defensive coordinator there, making the jump from North Dakota State. You're putting him in a really hard spot. And, it's going to be fascinating to see just how competitive this team is. The reaction from players, at least publicly, has not been one that indicates that they are very happy to see that Pat Fitzgerald is gone. He's a guy who, historically, I think we all think of as someone who his players love him. And I think that's still kind of proving to be the case, at least with the reaction that we've seen so far. It doesn't feel like his players are any too happy to not have him anymore. So what will the deal be there? I don't know. Going to be fascinating to see, though, because they're going to struggle this year, I think. By the time Purdue goes up there in late November, it's entirely possible that this team has just completely quit and that there's just nothing there, that they're just waiting for the season to end. We'll see. It's going to be fascinating to see how the Wildcats do this season. But, moving forward, getting into some of the mailbag questions I got, and I had a twofer, 2 questions that got emailed to me. And number one is something that I've talked about a few times, and it's something that I enjoy talking about, and that is non-conference scheduling. And I think this was Charles who emailed that. Let me double check that first. Yeah, it was Charles here. He asked, should Purdue prioritize 3 cupcake non-conference games for easier bowl eligibility, or schedule more high-profile non-conference games to receive more national visibility/relevance? And he said, for example, Purdue versus Notre Dame would be guaranteed to air on NBC or Fox. And then he also pointed to a historic example of how Bobby Bowden really raised the profile of Florida State. They were independent at that time, and they scheduled a very difficult schedule, got on TV quite a bit, and ultimately, developed the Seminoles into the power of the late 80s to early 2000s in college football. My answer is pretty simple on this. I genuinely do not believe that there is much of an incentive to scheduling a difficult non-conference schedule. Now, I will absolutely give you the credence that it's fun to play in more high-profile games. There is more juice for Purdue hosting another Power 5 non-conference opponent than there is for Purdue hosting Indiana State or Ball State or, fill in the MAC school, or even Fresno State, who's a good group of 5 school. But, the juice isn't quite the same there. Now, if you do that, when you schedule these high-profile teams, you at least want to be competitive. That's kind of the quiet part here, is if you're going to do that and you're going to take on a tougher schedule, you better at least be competitive in those games. I look back to, Purdue's got the return game of Virginia Tech this year. Virginia Tech came to town in 2015, and that game was not even remotely competitive. Now, Purdue was terrible. They went 2-10 that year, but that wasn't fun. You're doing yourself a disservice just to go out there and get waxed. I think it's fine to play another power conference team every year. I've long said, I think the perfect way to do it is an FCS team, a group of 5 team, and a Power 5 team. In theory, you're going to get 2 wins there, and then see what happens with a Power 5 team you schedule. I think you probably want to schedule a Power 5 team that's a little more similar to you. To schedule someone like a Southern, they're Southern Cal's coming to the Big Ten, but, to schedule a Texas or a Florida State, I don't know that you need to do that. But if you schedule a Georgia Tech or like Oregon State, probably a pretty good one to do. A little more similarity there. In terms of the television exposure that comes with playing a high-profile game, I don't know that it's as important as it used to be. Now, like you look back at when Bobby Bowden, Florida State, raised their brand, they were independent, so they had control of what at that time was probably all 11 games, whereas if at Purdue, you're only scheduling 3. The other 9 are being scheduled for you. But, back then, there were no conference networks. There were no ESPN2, ESPNU, Fox Sports 1. There weren't all these alternative ways to get games. It was really what was on national TV was what you got. Now, it's pretty easy anywhere in the country to see a Purdue game if you want to watch it. My grandfather lives out in southern Nevada, and he can watch every Purdue football and basketball game that he ever wants. He gets Big Ten Network, he gets the ESPNs, FS1. The viewership is better for the games that are on ABC, NBC, Fox, CBS. That part's very true. You reach more people, but, if you want to watch a Purdue game, it's very easy to do that. I don't think that you're like selling recruits on the concept of, we're going to play on national broadcast television more. That's probably a pretty moot point these days. Another thing, too, that I'd point to with the TV selections, it's all relative. Like this year, Purdue is playing Syracuse in the 7:30 primetime slot on NBC. I mean this with all due respect to both Purdue and Syracuse. A fun matchup, a good matchup. Two teams that, certainly from what we saw last year, very evenly matched, a good game. I don't know that that's your typical primetime national broadcast matchup. That's not exactly, Notre Dame versus Ohio State or Alabama versus Texas. It's all relative to what the other games in the Big Ten that week are. I don't know that bowl eligibility means what it used to, and that's kind of the hard part here is that, if getting to 6-6 is the goal, I think, and I hate saying this because it's a bummer, because I like bowl games, but they simply don't mean what they used to. You look at the last two seasons, Purdue's best players haven't played. David Bell, George Karlaftis sit out against Tennessee. O'Connell, Charlie Jones, Payne Durham, Corey Trice, and Jalen Graham all sit out against LSU. This is not going to stop. This is not a trend that is going to just disappear. It is what it is. So, I don't know that your goal is to get to 6-6 and go play in the heart of Dallas Bowl like it was a decade ago. The 12-team college football playoff, that's only going to devalue bowl games more. Another reason why I don't like it, but it is what it is. So, I don't think the bowl game itself is what you're playing for, but I do think that just putting yourself in a position to win as many games as possible is inherently good. I think everyone would rather go 7-5 against an easier schedule than 5-7 against a more difficult schedule. I don't think there's much of a debate there. And he also asked, is the elimination of Big Ten divisions a good or bad thing for Purdue? Because he pointed to the fact that the strength of schedule across the Big Ten will be a little bit more balanced without the divisions, the three best teams all being on the same side. It's certainly unfavorable for Purdue. It is what it is. It's the right thing for the Big Ten. And that's what it's kind of hard for. It's hard for me to say that this is a bad decision because while it impacts Purdue negatively, it would be impossible to run two 8-team divisions. At that point, you don't have a conference. That would be really difficult. You wouldn't see the teams from the other side hardly ever. You're adding another Goliath to the conference in Southern Cal. They're in position to be really good for a long time with Lincoln Riley. UCLA is doing some good things with Chip Kelly. This expansion, it's not about benefiting the teams in the Big Ten competitively. It's all about money. And that's what it comes down to. The strength of schedule being a little more balanced will be a great thing for the Big Ten. It's going to be a good thing from a fan perspective to see some of these teams. Michigan hasn't come to Ross-Ade Stadium since 2017. Purdue and Rutgers have played twice ever. And fans haven't been able to see Rutgers at Ross-Ade Stadium. The only time it happened was the COVID season when no fans could go. It's going to be nice that isn't as big of a problem anymore, but competitively, it doesn't help Purdue. You're going to play Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State more often. You're adding USC into the rotation. It doesn't help Purdue necessarily, but it will make for a better product in the Big Ten, and it will. Charles is very right here. The competitive balance will be much better. There won't be the lopsided nature of it. There will still be teams that get, better draws in an individual year than others, but it won't be super lopsided like it has been in the past. I had a question on Twitter about the stadium renovations. If I had any insight on updates and how I think the renovations will enhance the game day experience? Good question. As far as the, any updates, no, I know nothing. I can track the web cameras that they have just like anyone else, but I don't have any insight there. All indications are that it's going to be ready to roll come September 2nd, that the tunnel's going to be ready and the south end zone will be ready. Just as a reminder, the renovations are the tunnel at the northeast corner of the stadium, going to connect to the football performance complex. The players will walk under the street there that goes along the east side of the stadium and run onto the field. Purdue no longer has to cross the street. Kind of weird how that happened for so long, but there's going to be a tunnel. The south end zone will be closed off. There will be seating there. There will be some open areas for students to congregate. And yes, the students will be moved there from the northeast corner of the stadium where they were to the south end zone and wrapping around on the southeast corner of the stadium. And then the nutrition complex out in the north parking lot of the stadium, that's not going to be ready till 2024. But I think that was always the case. In terms of the game day experience, the tunnel's going to be great. I think that, as we talked about, I think it was last week, about things that Purdue can do to become cooler, I think you could do some pretty cool things with the tunnel. Not necessarily, doesn't have to be Nebraska's tunnel walk or something, but that'll be cool. You can do some fun things with a team entrance rather than just running through a giant inflatable train like they did for so long. The south end zone, it's one that I think is a little bit, double-edged sword in my mind. In one sense, they needed to do something with it. The concept of having the beer garden there was a good one at the time. It had kind of run its course. You look at, now that alcohol can be served throughout the stadium, it's, there's no real incentive to go down to the beer garden anymore unless you just don't really want to watch the game. Different. So it was time. It was time to put something back in there. I think putting the students down there is going to be interesting. Generally, I don't love the idea of just telling the students to go be in the end zone. I think it probably not my favorite. I kind of liked how they had it before, but, at the same time, it could make for a cool environment. You get, something like late in the game, the opposing team going into that end zone. That could be really cool. That could absolutely be really cool to have all the students down there. The only thing that I don't really like about the renovation, and I shouldn't say that I don't like it, expanding capacity by about 8,000 more seats. Purdue estimated that the capacity will be at about 65,000 when the renovation is done. I'm always a fan, in general, of filling a smaller stadium than having empty seats in a bigger stadium. Bigger isn't always better when it comes to stadiums, right? Purdue has done well with attendance the last few years. They had the stat the other day that Purdue Athletics tweeted out that they had 100% capacity for football last year. I don't know how they got to that number, but that's neither here nor there. There were some empty seats there, and there were some unsold tickets there. But I think, I'll be interested to see how they sell the seats that used to be student seats this year. Largely those aren't great tickets. You're going into the corner. Some of them are good. When you get on the side there, they're fine. But, if you're way up in the northeast corner on the upper half of the stadium, is Purdue selling those tickets? Because if that's just going to be an empty zone, then I don't know. I don't know how great it is. But that's the only thing that I'll say, could be a detriment, is just more empty seats. But, if you can get to a point where you can start filling 65,000, then, that's even better. That's fantastic. So we'll see how that goes. That's the only thing that I don't love about the stadium renovation, but I think as a whole, it's going to be a very, very big net positive for Purdue. I had a good one as well from Twitter about Purdue's cornerback room. The defensive backs here. Even though the talent at corner may be less established, is it possible that improvements in coaching and scheme will more than make up for the lack of proven talent? And this is the classic Jimmys and Joes or the X's and O's debate. Is it about the players? Is it about the coaching? What's the blend of that? Generally in these conversations, I'll always side with having better talent. The ceiling is simply higher when you have better talent compared to what theoretically is better coaching. I'll take the talent most of the time, but let's look at this. Last year, Purdue's corners, you had Corey Trice, Jamari Brown, Reese Taylor, Bryce Hampton. This year, you're looking at Jamari Brown as the lone holdover. Marquise Wilson, Salim Turner Muhammad, a couple guys transferring in. Botros Alessandro, a JUCO recruit. Markevius Brown, Braxton Myers, both guys transferring in from Ole Miss. Some question marks of who those guys will be that are the key contributors. But I think, Ryan Walters obviously has built his reputation based off his defense. Sorry for the dog bark there. But he's built his reputation based off defense. And, what he can do with these corners is going to be a fascinating part of this season. It's no secret what he did at Illinois. Devin Witherspoon turning into a top 10 pick. Top 5? Did he go 5th overall? Somewhere around there. Into an elite talent. Had some other really good defensive backs there. It's not like last year's Purdue group was loaded with elite talent in the defensive backfield. Corey Trice was really good. He was a really good corner for Purdue. Big, long, rangy, a little bit physical. He's the best corner Purdue has had in a while. But, the rest of the guys were fine. Reese Taylor, Bryce Hampton, they were okay. Jamari Brown, fine. But Trice is the guy that you'll really miss the most. This year, it's going to come down, in terms of how good they are, to Wilson and Turner Muhammad. These are guys who were 4-star recruits out of high school, never quite broke out at Penn State and Stanford, respectively, but, the talent is theoretically there. They should have the opportunity to make a big impact this year. If they are legitimate Big Ten starting caliber corners, then I think, you could look at feeling pretty decent about it, but they got to stay healthy. This is not a group with tremendous depth, and that's kind of the concern, is that if you have an injury or two, this unit's really thin. So is it possible that Purdue's cornerback room could be better than it was last year? Maybe, but you're really relying on these transfers to be hits, and sometimes it's hit or miss. We'll see what happens, but Purdue's got to stay healthy there for them to have a chance to be better at corner than it was last year. And then finally, a closing one that got emailed to me, and a topic that I can't say I know a ton about, but one that I've certainly heard, is the comparison from Steve, who emailed the show, about college football and European soccer being similar. And he talked about how college football is similar in the sense that only a small percentage of teams over in Europe have a real chance at winning the championship, but everyone, even of the teams that don't have a chance, all the fans are super passionate, still really into it. I'll take his word for it. I don't watch soccer, so I have no idea if what he's saying is valid or not, but I have no reason to not believe him. I think that's a pretty real thing. In college football, how many teams really enter this season with a realistic hope of winning a national title? A dozen at most, if that. You're probably in single digits of teams that are coming into this fall really thinking they could win a national title. Georgia, Bama, LSU maybe, Ohio State, Michigan, Southern Cal maybe. I mean, it's a thin group. The one thing he points out, though, that I'll focus on and kind of, in that discussion of in-person attendance is that he talks about how those fans in Europe still pack the stadiums every game. And, this is something that's going to be interesting to watch moving forward. It's never been more appealing if you're just a college football fan to stay at home on a Saturday. As we said, every game really in the world you can watch. You don't have, tickets are expensive, parking is expensive, and, unless you're in Lafayette or maybe Indianapolis, if you're a Purdue fan, it takes the entire day to be, you're not seeing much other football. So, we've seen it at Purdue. The attendance fluctuates greatly with the success of the team. Joe Tiller era, Purdue had fantastic attendance numbers. Danny Hope and Daryl Hazel era, Purdue had very poor attendance numbers. Then it bounced back under Jeff Brom. It's pretty simple there. Most schools are like that. There are very few schools in the country that are selling out every game, no matter how good the team is. Texas, Alabama, Georgia, LSU, Notre Dame, to name a few. But the majority of schools, even in the Power Five, are like Purdue in the sense that they'll sell out if the team's good, but if they're not selling out. They're not coming close. That's what's going to be interesting. When you look at kind of the comparison there, I think it's a good comparison with my limited knowledge of European soccer. It's super rabid, and college football is the same way. This is a sport that the regular season is comprised of 25% of the calendar. It's 13 out of the 52 Saturdays of the year. Yet there are millions of people like myself who live for it. It's by far their favorite sport. College football is leaps and bounds ahead of college basketball in terms of my favorite sport. I love it. It only takes up a small part of the year, but the passion around college football is unlike anything else. It is absolutely special, and I'll trust Steve that European soccer is the same. It's a lot of fun. College football is the absolute best, and it's not going anywhere. It's a very unique sport in that regard. But that's all I've got for today. I'm not sure what we're going to talk about next week yet. I will either do another episode like this with various topics, or I may do one last little basketball touch-up before we get into football. Just kind of talk a little bit of summer basketball, Europe trip, all of that. We'll see, but I'll have something for you next week. And then after that, we're getting into the countdown to kickoff. So we're almost there. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at BoilersBeyond. Come send anything my way there. And email the show if you'd like, boilersandbeyondpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Got a lot of good stuff coming to you here pretty soon. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And until next week, guys, take care.